is I'll job you in and say that your other name is Skippy.
Yeah, that's right.
I'll read out what it said in our email about the advising about this talk, because it's very impressive. Mark's talk tonight will be called Living on a Razor's Edge, a Personal Perspective in Trying to Balance Fire Management for both Asset Protection and Biodiversity. A little bit of background on Mark. He recently joined the staff at Ku-Ring-Gai Council. He's a respected and innovative environmental planner and ecological scientist with a wealth of experience working at all government levels and consulting positions as well, working in both administration and scientific capacities. Mark has more than 10 years' experience being involved in the challenging field of bushfire planning, particularly relating to risk assessment, legislative processes, and the area of biodiversity and bushfire impacts. So that's really something, and people like you are very much needed, especially lately.
I found that out.
Yeah, much in demand. Okay, thank you, Mark.
So tonight, I'm pleased to meet you all via Skype or via Zoom, as we all use these days. And I'd much prefer to be in a live meeting because I love talking to people and watching their faces, and vice versa, I'm sure, but we'll try as well as we can. Yes, my nickname is Skippy, and with very good reason. When I was quite young, I trained in acting, and I came to Sydney for an audition. I think it was in 1967 or 68, but I didn't make it for Skippy. So there we go. So I do have a background. And now I'm living at Ku-Ring-Gai Showgrounds, only I think it's 2.9 kilometres from where some of the filming was done at the famed Waratah National Park. So that's the story about it. But tonight I'm going to give you a very personal perspective on fire management as I see it, between asset protection and the wonderful biodiversity side, which scientists through Australia are still exploring. Every week new research papers come out. Now I'm going to try and page down. Yes, and it did work. That's great. No guesses for when I first came down here in August last year. We decided, my wife and myself, we both love home and away, so we thought we'd go up towards a cafe where they film much, and we went up to the Barrenjoey headland, and there in front of us, of course, was a hazard reduction taking place via helicopter. I had a dear friend who was in the helicopter called Lee Nolan from National Parks in New South Wales, and she was dropping pills, as they call them, to do the hazard reduction. And only 2 weeks ago, I went to have a look at the results of that and the regrowth, and it was quite a lovely hazard reduction burn. But we're going to talk about a bit about that further on. A bit about myself. I'm a pretty complex sort of fellow. I'm in my mid-60s now. I should be retiring, but I reckon I've got another 10 years to go, and I want to keep working too. I was born and bred in southern Queensland. I grew up around the backside of Brisbane. I've lived in Toowoomba for many years. I brought up 4 boys. Roma, just before I came down here, I was for 4 years in the Carnarvon Ranges as their fire ranger, a lot of walking. And I did a stint in Royal National Park as their fire coordinator for a bit over a year. I started my work in casino in northern New South Wales as a ranger with the Department of used to call New South Wales Forestry, Forest Commissioner of New South Wales, so in the wonderful casino and border ranges area. As a boy, I was in the Queensland Naturals Club. I had a wonderful mentor called Barry Jenke, my school teacher, and he took me out nearly every weekend on excursions, and just some wonderful naturalists on both plant and animal and geology side. So I got to know the bush pretty well when I was quite young. Since February 2009, I've worked on fire management. You might ask why February 2009. That's when Black Saturday was, and I did lose 3 of my family members there. Their name were the Zans. They lived at King Lake, and Richard Zan was an ornithologist he worked on finches. He did a book on finches through Oxford Uni Press, and he and his wonderful wife and my niece, they died unfortunately in Black Saturday. So that made me a lot more aware of what can happen, because I knew Richard and Eileen. They were very used to fires where they lived. They were right up against the national park in the mountain ash country, but this fire was just beyond what they'd seen in their 30 years there. So it just goes to show you have to appreciate what fire can do on both ends. I've worked as a fire planner, a fire researcher, and a fire ranger, which I particularly loved in the Carnarvon Ranges. A lot of that was both stopping wildfires, sometimes not stopping them, sometimes letting the fire run for biodiversity purposes, and at other sides, putting hazard reduction burns or biodiversity burns in whenever we thought the country might need it. I've worked for just over 40 years now in the public service, and in Canberra, I've worked in Queensland, I've worked all over the place and loved it. I've had a great life, working life, but fire has been the most complex topic I've ever had to deal with in my life. I'll tell you that. It impinges upon everything, and everything impinges upon fire. I love things like bushwalking, nature, writing and reading. I did a major in Australian literature as well as science when I was younger. So, I'm very inquisitive, and I suppose that's essential in my role. I never stop thinking about fire. I can honestly, most nights I lie awake and I think about some crazy thing with fire. So always thinking. That's me. Just before I came down here, I was in the Carnarvon Ranges off for a 4-day walk across the top of the ranges. Quite beautiful. Major Mitchell went to this area near Salvatore Rosa where I was, and he had camped there for about 3 months. Edmund Kennedy, the explorer, was there for a while too. Wonderful area called Mitchell Springs, and I'm up here at about 950 metres. You can see a fire had been through. It had been through there about 4 months previously. There had been some rain. We get very little rain up around Roma, about 200 to 250 mils a year. So it's been shocking being down here for me. But good regrowth after rain. But out and about, I love walking the country, as they say, and you learn so much by being out and about. I've worked on rainforest when I was a lot younger. This is in southern Queensland, between the towns of Warwick and Killarney on the main range. And actually that main range, about 55% of all the rainforest areas were burnt in the last big fires that came right through New South Wales too. So right into rainforest, into subtropical rainforest. People say it's unprecedented. Whether that was or not, I'm not too sure, but certainly it did touch up the rainforest in a big way. You can see I did plots there, and beautiful sort of country. But I've fallen in love with heath country and dry sclerophyll, particularly the woodlands, Sydney sandstone woodlands. I love them. Can't get enough of them. And I live in the showgrounds, and I'm often down on the fire trails, walking them, looking at plants and animals. So I just have a whale of a time. What did we lose in last summer's fires? This is a bit of a summary as far as ecologists know. Up to 3 billion animals. It seems incredible, perished, doesn't it? Mammals, 143 million. Birds, 180 million. Reptiles, 2.46 billion. Look at that, isn't it incredible? And frogs, 51 million. And those without the backbones, which are really 99% of all animals, insects, ants, spiders, and slugs, everything, snails. No one really knows how many went. Plants, fire burnt more than 97,000 square kilometres. That's more than 18 million football fields in area. And many animals and plants are now much closer to that tipping point where they drop over the edge to extinction. And remember, once something becomes extinct, it is forever. Although I had a wonderful mentor when I was younger. He was a mammalologist at the Queensland Museum. His name was Mike Archer, and he did try to clone the thylacine. It's in the bottle. You can go to the Australian Museum at the moment and see that very thylacine, but there were too many contaminants and he wasn't able to clone it. Maybe luckily. He copped a bit of flack over it. Living on the Razor's Edge, and that's the title of my talk. It does come from a song by Goanna, the Goanna Band, one of my favourite Australian bands. I play a lot of music. I play accordions of various types too. But Shane Howard, he wrote a song called Living on the Razor's Edge. And I feel coming down to Ku-Ring-Gai, I'm sitting on the razor's edge now. And for me, I suppose most of my fire management life, it's been trying to strike a happy medium or a balance, if you can, between asset protection, people and built structures, and the ecological side. And I'll talk a bit about fire regimes fairly soon. But just to let you know, Ku-Ring-Gai, local government area where I'm working, is the second most bushfire local government prone area in New South Wales. First, number one is actually Blue Mountains. Number two is Ku-Ring-Gai. Has a 130 kilometre bushland urban interface with 38% of all residents sitting on that razor's edge. The big question that is still eluding me at the moment: can we tailor-make our fire management to fit both the purposes in an extremely fire-prone environment? Case of conflict, that's what I call it, where we live. I'm luckily on something called the Hornsby Ku-Ring-Gai Bushfire Risk Management Committee. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's run from Hornsby, from Cowan, actually, up at the fire centre there. And they work out a plan. It's RFS, Fire and Rescue New South Wales, national parks, councils and other stakeholders, and we get together, work out a 3 to 5 year plan of where to put burns, where are the weak points, where can fire creep through to damage assets, and also try and be so aware of the ecological side of fire for both the plants, whether they be seeders or ridge sprouters, and fire frequencies. Is fire too frequent in certain areas? Is it too infrequent? And how to fit it in. But as I said again, you can see in red I've got there, can one program fit all? Because there's so many variables to account for. And I'm really interested in cumulative things, and I'll talk about that soon too. The relationship, people say fires can be too frequent or infrequent, and fire intensity, they work together, those two things. Not much is known about that. People tear apart a fire and look at things like fire frequency, how big an area did it burn, the mosaic nature of the fire, did it burn 50% of an area or 100% right through, and the intensity. But there's a thing in there called a fire trap. If you get an intense fire come through, it can cause further intense fires in the future, and that's called the fire trap. I might talk about that a bit further on. Fire in Australia, and I know Bill Gammage, the historian's done some wonderful work on that, and you've probably heard of his book. And this is a bit of a thing. The diagram on the left is pre-human, that's even pre-Aboriginal, before they got here about 80,000 years ago. And you can see some pretty big burn patches since long burn. Medium term, it might be, medium might be 10 to 20 years, and short term might be less than 10 years. So you can see large patches there. Then we've got the Aboriginals arrived about 80,000 years ago, and they broke up the countryside, supposedly, I'll say again, although I think in certain areas they put more fire in than in other areas. They often avoided high mountains, that type of thing, unless they had a pathway through it. So maybe lightning still lit many fires. The European fire regime, when us white fellas got to work about 1788, or just after Governor Phillip came through with his team up Middle Harbour, and burning happened everywhere then, either for grazing or opening up the country. So a lot of fire was put in, and with various consequences. So they're the human impacts. There's a wonderful book, it's a bit of a Bible for me, called Flammable Australia, by Ross Bradstock from University of Wollongong, and he's just retired. So, using fire to stop bushfire, yes, it can be done. As I say, the wildfires or bushfire can be intense and cause much damage to people, houses, and wildlife and plants. How do you lessen those impacts? Prescribed burning, and that can take many forms in what I call hazard reduction burns, which I'll show you in a moment. Eco burns and mosaic burning, and I want to tell you a bit about mosaic burning. And what's got the flavour of the month now is cultural burning. That's much like a low intensity mosaic burn, but it's done by Aboriginal people, and it's got added extras, which even though we in a council or national parks might do a low intensity mosaic burn, we still don't actually do a cultural burn. So it's a bit different and confusing too. Then we've got mechanical things Like we've got a team that goes around what we call our asset protection zones behind houses in Ku-Ring-Gai, fire prevention team, and they use choppers, so to speak, to clear the understory, try and break up any areas where there's continuous canopy or a mid-story layer, try and break it up to prevent the spread of fire. Education and awareness programs. Ku-Ring-Gai does have a wonderful program called Climate-Wise Communities, where we use something called a SIM table to show the spread of fire. If it started, say, in Hornsby, a northwesterly wind might drive it along the northern side of Ku-Ring-Gai, and it graphically shows us where those fires go within a day. Good planning. I was brought up as a planner, as an ecologist, making sure that people in bushfire-prone lands are not too mixed up. But the trouble is, houses are in many places in Ku-Ring-Gai. Let's have a look at a mosaic burn. This is on Moreton Island in my own homeland, and you can see the patches of fire there, the darkened areas, and that's about a 30 to 40% coverage across the landscape. Now, this is how mosaic burns. You can see that reddy sort of peckish area there. That's the burnt area. A burn's been through that area, and we'll call that year 0. Okay. 8 years in, National Parks or Council or someone might decide to put a hazard reduction or an ecological burn in. So you put some strips of burn in. You can see the pattern it's made after 8 years. Where the pink was originally is now all regenerating bushland. So that's sort of hit it the second time. In another few years, another burn will go in a different direction. You can see the 8-year burn is now regenerating, and that plain mosaic burn in year 20 has gone in different patterns. So you don't get the same area being burnt every, say, 8 to 10 years. You put in a mosaic. Year 28, next burn goes in. That's provided no extra wildfires have come through, of course. And this is all theoretical. So you've got a different patch being burnt again. So you've got actually a real mosaic of burns at probably not a really high intensity. The flame height might be 2 to 3 metres, but it may get rid of some of your mid-story, which in the case of Ku-Ring-Gai with the many beautiful shrubs and proteaceae, banksias, all that type of thing may have an effect, and I'll talk about that soon. And I'm sure someone like Bill Jones might be quite interested in that too. Here you can see the fire history summary in year 28, where we've overlaid the wildfire mosaic patterns. So it's a very patchy sort of arrangement. And that gives a bit of a chance for animal communities and the plant communities to have a sort of mosaic, because we don't know a lot about all of these things yet, how we should be really burning for all the species. We can burn for a community like sandstone woodland on ridge tops. We can narrow fire down for that, or wet sclerophyll gullies. We can try and predict fire for those areas, but the best thing is to give a patchy type arrangement. I'm going to talk, I did mention the fire regime. Now, with fire and ecological communities or biodiversity, there's 4 important aspects of fire. It's the frequency, how often a fire is in a given area, the extent, how large is the fire, or the patchiness of the fire. As I said before, does it burn 20% of an area, or 80%, or just blacken the whole area, as something that might have gone through Ku-Ring-Gai, say in 94 fire, where it blackened many, many areas. Fire season, what time of the year does a wildfire? Often it will be October through to March, say, but when should we put our hazard reduction burns in for both plants and animals? What time of year? And I'm just reading a wonderful book at the moment, brought out by CSIRO, about seasons. Our traditional 4 seasons are now being broken up, as the Aboriginal people do, into many different seasons, and we can try and relate fire back to the different seasons. So fire intensity, and that's kilowatts per square metre. I can't put the little superscript for inept in words, so I couldn't put that in. But the intensity of fire, is it a true landscape wildfire which would get into the canopy, or is it trickling amongst the lower stratum and the leaf litter, a nice cool fire? So for all those 4 things, frequency, extent, season and intensity, all important with fire management. Now, what are the implications for biodiversity or plants and animals? And I've done this for Queensland because I'm used to Queensland. 29 species of 96 priority species were impacted by inappropriate fire regimes, which was the second highest priority threat. Highest was urban development, around the sprawl around Brisbane to Toowoomba, threatening species. But inappropriate fire regimes were a very heavy threat. They're the second most important threatening factor in overall Australian mammal loss, and we have lost quite a few mammals. And fires, as I mentioned, can be either too frequent or no fires at all, and that can erode the biodiversity. And I'm going to talk about something called the eastern bristlebird. It's up in the border ranges, up in northern New South Wales and southern Queensland, and also down behind Nowra in the Nadji area. Also, it's got two sort of populations, the northern and the southern one. And I'll tell you a bit about the eastern bristlebird. But first, I'm going to show you just a few pictures. Up the top, it shows tall open forest. Talks a bit about ideal fire regimes for those types. Now, you could equate that type of thing with the small remnants we've got, which are critically endangered, of the high blue gum communities. And it says we might want to fire every 7 to 25 years if you want to keep shrubby understory, or 3 to 6 years for grassy understory, late summer to autumn. And it says this wants a moderate to high intensity fire. And that's mainly so that things can seed. These tall eucalypts need seeding. They can't grow from very sprouting. Very different to the woodland picture below. It's got different fire regime requirements, and it really would like an intensity of low to moderate. So all these are different fire regimes for different types of vegetation or ecological communities. Here you've got heathland, intensity low to high, and actually heath is quite uncontrollable. It either, when you put a burn in, it either won't burn at all, very hard to get burning, but once it starts burning, it's like a tinderbox and goes like a bomb, as we know from North Head or South Head when they have been burns there. Very unpredictable, hazardous in the extreme. People have lost their lives in it. I remember when I came to Royal National Park, one day I walked by a series of 5 crosses in the bush, and they were from 5 firefighters who did perish along the fire trail. So often in heathland, you don't want to be near it when it does burn, either intentionally or even with a hazard reduction burn. So again, different fire requirements. This is near my beloved showgrounds, unhealthy country. There had been a hot fire in there, not the nicest sort of result, and this is still a few years after a fire. See a lot of dead material. You can put a fire in, it might be for hazard reduction. If it's not that successful, you'll still get a lot of dead material retained there, and it becomes an even bigger threat if a wildfire was to come through. So you've got to be so careful with fire and put in a proper fire. You've got to know what you're doing. And even after 15 years in it now, I'm sort of still learning, and I learn from whoever and whenever I can, and just walk in country. A good hazard reduction. This was over when I worked in Royal in 2015 before I went back up to Roma. We put in some hazard reduction burns on the eastern end of Royal near Bundina. Very little canopy scorch, even left some patches of litter for even invertebrates to creep around, and snakes or lizards if there are any, and a really nice burn. That was only a few weeks after the burn, so quite a good successful hazard reduction in terms of biodiversity. But is that in terms of acid protection too? The eastern pygmy possum, which I'm sure Bill Jones will tell us more about anyway. I love this picture. My better half, Sandra, she loves pygmy possums, and we've started to go looking for them now along our fire trails in the northern part of the showgrounds. Here's a bit of a map, I'm told. Close your eyes if you look at this. You can see Monavar Road over there on the right, the showgrounds on the extreme right, and pygmy possum locations. I'm sure most of you would know they're right along that northern stretch of Ku-Ring-Gai. A hazard reduction burn, a large one, you can see a purple sort of line there. It's going to go in north of that area contained in, it's called Cayley's, after the old naturalists, early naturalists. George Cayley, and who traversed that country very, very early on. And Cayley's burn is going to be quite large. The only trouble, it encompasses areas where there are many known records of the pygmy possum. So it's a real issue. And I've spoken to national parks recently about this burn. And of course, with Bill Jones's work and my compatriot Jacob Soft and others, there's been a number of recommendations for burning to assist with the pygmy possum itself, which is so important because they are restricted, they're patchy, and they're beautiful animals too, but it's only one animal, remember. So we're kicking up a bit of a fuss about this one animal. And you can see how complex it is for just the pygmy possum, because it does rely on Banksias, particularly Banksia ericofolia, the heath Banksia, which is now, I've been wandering around and the cones on some of them are coming right out now. They're getting quite large, the cones for them. So it's a good time. So National Parks and Wildlife wanted to put in their burn very, very soon. I said, maybe not now isn't the best time. So they're prepared to wait until the flowerings happen. But then the other issue is the food source burnt out? That's another issue. And these things aren't always picked up. So the really important thing, I think I've said down there at the bottom, as Jacob and Bill would no doubt say, is continuity of pygmy possum habitat. That we keep the habitat there, that they have enough food sources, shelter sources. And unfortunately with pygmy possums, they rely on the mid-stratum. Often fire and rescue or rural fire services loves to get rid of the mid-stratum where all the shrubs are because it reduces the laddering of fuels, but you need large areas of mid-stratum too. So it shows how complex it really is. And not forgetting the flora. There's many rare and threatens in there, Tetratheca, Leptospermum denii, all sorts of things, Heligodendrons, and of course, as Wendy introduced me to at the showgrounds, good old Genoplesium boweri. So all these things, some of the orchids may or may not tolerate fire. How do we really know? Has there been sufficient studies? And some of them might sprout from the base, others not. Others might rely totally on seeding. So you might have to wait till a juvenile gets to mature, produces seed, then drops that seed before you put a fire in, which could be many years. It might take a longer time. And here you can see from a National Parks database, you can see prescriptions for various species, Tetratheca up the top. No more fire than every 7 years, the minimum frequency, 10 years further down for Darwinia biflora. No really long schedules there. The Persunia, Mollia down the bottom, no more fire than once every 12 years. So you can see trying to draw those fire cycles out for the seeding cycles of seeders versus through sprouters. Eastern bristlebird, aren't they beautiful? They're quite amazing. But in the border ranges where I used to work for many years, there were no more than 50 birds. And quite a few people went looking for them. And it kept me fit too, wandering around. I'll tell you a little bit about them. Disappearing habitat. We think the reason some of the populations might have really gone from this bird, which is when I was young, I used to roam the border ranges on foot. There used to be quite a few of them. I wish I'd recorded where they all were. When I was an avid bird watcher from 15 years to 20, and there used to be a lot of bristlebirds. Fire used to maintain this habitat. There'd be lightning strikes, and a lot of areas would become quite grassy, covered with lomandras, which they love. Those birds love them. Now fire has been excluded from many areas of National Park, and it's become thickened up with acacias on the mountain tops, and the habitat isn't there for these birds. And then you get a very intense fire coming through, destroying the birds and their nests. And we think it's probably fire regimes, of course. Also foxes, possibly. Cats, foxes taking eggs, that type of thing. And they're going to monitor them intensely after 19 to 20 fires in the border ranges. That's me, Skippy and the native olive. I'll tell you about this. This again, and unfortunately, is from southern Queensland. In a terrible area between Brisbane and Ipswich, which used to be torn up for beautiful pottery. It's called the Dinmore Ebvale area, and it was a pottery sort of centric area where the beautiful pots were made from clay dug out of quarries. But there was a wonderful notoleia there, Ipsivensis. It was discovered in 1976 by a wonderful naturalist who's now deceased, unfortunately, called Lloyd Bird. Previously, he was a coal miner, but he loved plants and he discovered this one. I worked for Main Roads for 2 years up there. My main role was fire coordinator for Main Roads. I said, hey, look, Mark Skippy, there are less than 22 of these plants in 3 populations, right along the main road as I could have it, which was haunted by arsonists at various times a year. And we decided to tag each plant, have a good look at it, get some genetic work done by the Queensland Herbarium and monitor each plant. So this is getting really sort of detailed stuff. They did have really great lignotubers we found out, and that's you can see Notoleia Ipsivensis. There were hybrids too with another one. So all this hybridisation in Notoleias, or the native olives, was going on. And unfortunately, a fire did come. An arsonist did come one day into our very patch. Unfortunately, some were burnt, others luckily weren't burnt. But we watched 1 or 2 plants that were burnt. After about a year, they came back. I'll go back up. And this one really sort of suckered. It did really well after a moderate fire. I don't know about an intense fire. Again, we don't have the data. Certain species, the good old Banksias, old man Banksia, which I so love looking at, a hot fire really needs to release its seeds from the old man Banksia. And this is in southern Queensland in the Cooloola country. Many of you might have heard about a big fire in Fraser Island. This is on the coastline. Often wildfires would go through that very heathy country. See all the hakeas here, as there are hakeas, of course, down this way, and they would open up after the hot fires. And there you go, quite beautiful, even after a fire. So they need that hot fire to release it. You can't see the hand actions I'm doing, you can't see them. You can only see the presentation. That's in the high blue gum forest near St Ives, looking pretty bushy. Sort of the mid-stratum's getting a bit thick in there too. So not too much regeneration amongst some of those Sydney blue gums, becoming a bit of an issue too. And it tells you a bit about the complexity. And I'm going to talk about that for a minute or two. Really, the blue gum high forest requires a moderate to a high intensity fire. I think we spoke about that to get the seedlings going again. But how do you achieve that in a really fragmented environment, which backs onto truly suburbia and beautiful St Ives, the houses there? Eco burns. Council in 2014 to 16 put in a number of eco burns. We haven't got too much data. I'm going back through the data now, but a lot of the areas have pretty high wattle and she oak thickets coming through them, and definitely lowered ground and mid-stratum diversity. And I think some of these areas need a cooler burn to restore the habitat. Maybe even, you know, the cultural type burn. Pittosporum invasion, which you would all know, alters the community composition. Maybe in some ways for the interface zone in Ku-Ring-Gai is great. It lowers the fire potential, having a lot of pittosporum, but again, you're losing a lot of your native species by the pittosporum thickening up. So what do we really want? Do we want to preserve past landscapes? Do we want a new novel landscape happening with pittosporum, which will lower fire risk, supposedly? And I'll talk about fire risk. The key is to really get to know how your local piece of bushland ticks. That's half my job, getting to know these areas in terms of how they tick, their resilience. And my big issue, as I've wandered Ku-Ring-Gai, I've wandered it on foot a lot of the time. I haven't had a vehicle for the last 4 months since I've been here. So I've wandered the edges on foot. And if a fire got into the canopy here, a lot would happen, I can tell you. I don't want a landscape canopy fire. They seem to happen in parts of Ku-Ring-Gai about every 12 to 18 years. We are due for one. There was a huge one in '94, and people continue to show me wonderful photos of what did happen. Even a lot to me, where I live in the showgrounds, that was pretty badly burnt. So yeah, it's getting to know fire in your local area. Climate change, what will that do? As we've learnt, the fire seasons are becoming longer. Fires could become far more intense. Droughts could be longer, but also rainfall periods could become longer. So who really knows? It's a hard one. So that's my presentation, and I've got to try and see how I stop the screen sharing now. I'll try and reduce that somehow. Yeah.